the shocking truth. It was never about attraction. Let me start with something that might sting. If a narcissist cheated on you, it wasn't because the other person was better. It wasn't because they were more attractive. It wasn't because they were more exciting. It wasn't because they had something you lacked. And the most unsettling part, it may not have even been about them at all. Emily learned this the hard way. She was sitting alone in her Chicago apartment, the city lights glowing outside her window when the truth hit her like cold water. Her boyfriend, Daniel, had slept with someone else. Not just someone else, someone he used to mock, someone he called boring, someone he said he would never touch, someone who, in Emily's mind, didn't even compare. Her chest tightened, her brain started racing. Why her? Why someone like that? Was I not enough? Was I too much? Was I too strong, too soft, too confident, not confident enough? If you've ever been in that position, you know that spiral. The endless mental autopsy of yourself. You start dissecting your body, your personality, your ambition, your sex appeal, your kindness, your flaws. You search for the missing ingredient that made them choose someone else. But here is the truth no one tells you. They didn't choose her. They chose what she represented. And that is a completely different story. Because when a narcissist sleeps with anyone, it is not an act of connection. It is an act of regulation. And until you understand that difference, you will torture yourself trying to solve a puzzle that was never meant to be solved through comparison. Healthy intimacy is rooted in connection, and it grows from emotional resonance. It requires vulnerability. It requires seeing and being seen. It is about two nervous systems synchronizing in safety. But for a narcissist, intimacy often serves a different psychological function entirely. It becomes a transaction, not a meeting of souls, not a deepening of attachment, not a celebration of mutual desire, a transaction, an exchange, a tool. It becomes a way to regulate something they cannot regulate internally. Here is what most people miss. When a narcissist pursues someone sexually, they are not primarily pursuing pleasure. They are pursuing proof that they still matter, proof that they are still desirable, proof that they can still access someone's body, proof that they can still override someone's boundaries, proof that they still have power. It's not about the person. It's about the reflection. Imagine someone who does not have a stable sense of self-worth inside. Imagine someone whose identity feels fragile, whose value feels conditional, whose significance feels dependent on external feedback. Now imagine that person walking through life constantly needing mirrors, not literal mirrors, human mirrors. Every time someone says yes, every time someone flirts back, every time someone gives them access, every time someone crosses a line for them, that yes becomes a reflection. I still exist. I still have it. I'm still powerful. I'm still wanted. The individual could change, the face could change, the body could change, the personality could change, but the function remains the same, validation. And that is why the question, why her, is so painful. Because you are asking it from the wrong psychological framework. You are assuming intimacy equals preference. You are assuming sex equals selection. You are assuming that if they chose someone else, it must mean that person had something you did not. But what if there was no comparison happening at all? What if there was no ranking system? What if the only criteria was availability and opportunity? That is the part that feels shocking, because if they can sleep with someone they criticized, someone they claimed they didn't even like, someone they described as not their type, then what does that say about you? It says you were never in a competition. You were in proximity to someone trying to escape themselves. And that's a very different reality. Daniel didn't cheat because the other woman was extraordinary. He cheated because in that moment she provided something immediate and accessible, relief. relief from boredom, relief from insecurity, relief from the subtle anxiety that creeps in when their ego feels threatened, relief from feeling ordinary. The narcissistic mind does not prioritize compatibility the way a healthy, securely attached mind does. It prioritizes regulation. Availability often matters more than attraction. Opportunity matters more than connection. Access matters more than depth. This is why the behavior can feel so indiscriminate. It's not that they have no standards in the traditional sense. It's that their standards are internal, not relational. And the question isn't, do I deeply connect with this person? The question is, can this person give me what I need right now? That need might be validation. It might be excitement. It might be power. It might be ego repair. And here is where it gets even more uncomfortable. Sometimes the more random the choice, the stronger the impact. If they cheat with someone impressive, you can tell yourself a story. She's younger. He's more successful. She's more attractive. But when they cheat with someone clearly incompatible, the ground disappears beneath your feet. Because now the message feels darker. It feels like anyone will do. And that destabilizes your nervous system. Because if anyone will do, then no one is special. If anyone will do, then what does intimacy even mean? If anyone will do, then what were we building? This is where the shock lands. Not because they found someone better, but because they weren't looking for better. They were looking for relief. Relief from an inner void. Relief from a restless dissatisfaction they cannot name. Relief from a sense of emptiness that hums quietly beneath their charm. And if you stay with me through this video, we're going to unpack that void in a way that may change how you see your entire relationship. But before we go deeper, I want to say something important. If this kind of content resonates with you, if you are someone who has been confused, destabilized, or silently questioning your own worth because of someone else's behavior, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now. Because we are not here to shame. We are not here to attack. We are here to understand, and understanding is power. When you understand the psychological architecture behind these behaviors, you stop internalizing blame that was never yours to carry. So if you want more content that helps you reclaim your clarity, your stability, and your sense of self, hit subscribe and support the channel so we can continue creating conversations like this. Now let's go even deeper. Because here's the final layer of this opening truth. You were never competing with another person. You were competing with a void. And a void cannot be outperformed. You cannot be beautiful enough. You cannot be successful enough. You cannot be supportive enough. You cannot be sexually adventurous enough. Because the void does not respond to quality, it responds to stimulation. And stimulation fades. That is why even when they are in a relationship with someone incredible, and they may still pursue others, not because the relationship lacks value, but because the internal emptiness resurfaces. And when it resurfaces, they seek something external to quiet it. This is not a comfortable realization, but it is a liberating one, because once you understand that the behavior was about their inability to sit with themselves, not your inadequacy, the self-blame begins to loosen its grip. So let me ask you something. When you look back at your relationship, what felt more true? A. They left because someone else was better than you. B. They left, or cheated, because they were trying to escape something inside themselves. Comment A or B below. I genuinely want to see how you're processing this. Because the moment you shift from comparison to comprehension, everything starts to change. And in the next part, we are going to explore what that inner void actually is, and why some people cannot feel real without external validation. Stay with me. The void. Why they can't feel real without you. The night after Emily confronted Daniel, something strange happened. He didn't cry. He didn't collapse in shame. He didn't even seem particularly moved by the damage. Instead, there was a flicker in his eyes, not guilt, not sorrow, but something closer to irritation. As if what truly bothered him wasn't the betrayal but the disruption of his equilibrium. That was the first clue. Because when someone devastates the person they claim to love and their primary reaction is not grief but discomfort, we are witnessing something deeper than selfishness. We are witnessing disconnection. To understand why a narcissist can sleep with almost anyone, you have to understand something that rarely gets discussed openly. Many of them do not feel fully real inside. This is not poetic language. It is psychological reality. There is a condition that develops when someone grows up in an environment where their authentic emotions were unsafe, ignored, shamed, or exploited. Over time, the nervous system adapts. The person learns to suppress vulnerability. They construct a version of themselves that can survive. But survival comes at a cost. The authentic self goes quiet, not destroyed, not erased, but muted. And what replaces it is performance, charm instead of connection, confidence instead of security, seduction instead of intimacy. From the outside, someone like Daniel can look magnetic. He can walk into a room in Chicago and command attention effortlessly. He knows how to read the room, and he knows how to flirt. He knows how to project power. But internally, there is often a subtle hum of emptiness. It's not depression in the classic sense. It's not necessarily sadness. It's something more hollow. A sense of not being anchored in oneself. A feeling of observing life instead of inhabiting it. Many people who struggle with narcissistic patterns describe it in moments of rare honesty as feeling like they are acting their own role. They know how to look engaged. They know how to say the right things. They know how to perform desire, but underneath there is a strange detachment. This detachment is a form of dissociation. Dissociation is not always dramatic. It doesn't always look like blackouts or extreme trauma responses. Sometimes it looks like emotional flatness. Sometimes it looks like chronic restlessness. Sometimes it looks like constantly chasing stimulation. When someone lives in that state long enough, normal experiences begin to feel muted. A stable relationship can start to feel boring. Consistency can feel suffocating. Security can feel dull. Because safety does not provide intensity. And intensity is often the only thing that cuts through the numbness. This is where sexual encounters come in. Not as romance, not as connection, but as sensation. Physical intimacy floods the body with chemicals. Dopamine rises, adrenaline spikes, the nervous system activates. For a moment, the person feels fully embodied. They feel heat, they feel power, they feel desired, they feel alive. For someone who has been living behind a layer of emotional glass, that rush can feel intoxicating. It's not the partner they're chasing, and it's the feeling of being awake. Marcus once described something similar during a late-night conversation in Los Angeles with a colleague who barely knew him. He had just ended another affair, and instead of triumph, there was confusion on his face. "I don't know why I keep doing this," he said quietly. "It feels incredible in the moment. And then, it's like I disappear again." That is the void, not a dramatic black hole, but a fading, a slipping back into disconnection. When someone relies on external stimulation to feel real, the effect is always temporary. The nervous system recalibrates, the dopamine drops, the intensity dissolves, and what returns is the baseline, the emptiness. So they seek it again, and again, and again. This is why the behavior often escalates during stress. If Daniel feels criticized at work, his ego destabilizes. If he feels overlooked, ordinary, or aging, the internal insecurity spikes. If he feels rejected or unappreciated, the emptiness grows louder. Instead of sitting with that discomfort, which would require vulnerability and self-reflection, He seeks a faster solution: attention, flirtation, sex, because it works, temporarily. What makes this pattern so confusing for partners like Emily is that from her perspective, the relationship itself should be enough to stabilize him. She loves him, she supports him, she affirms him. But when someone's internal structure is fragile, no amount of steady love can replace internal regulation. This is where many partners burn themselves out. They think, if I'm more affectionate, if I'm more adventurous, if I'm more understanding, if I'm more patient, he won't need anyone else. But the truth is devastatingly simple. You cannot become someone else's nervous system. You cannot supply enough external validation to repair internal fragmentation. And here's something even more uncomfortable. Sometimes the very stability you offer can trigger the void. Because stability requires presence, and presence requires feeling. If someone has spent decades avoiding authentic feeling, being deeply seen can feel threatening. It can expose the fragility underneath the persona, so they escape into distraction. Not because you are insufficient, but because being real feels unsafe. When we talk about the void, we are not talking about evil. We are not talking about monsters. We are talking about adaptation, a child who learned that their emotions were too much, a teenager who discovered that vulnerability invited humiliation, and a young adult who realized that admiration was easier to secure than love. Over time, admiration replaces attachment, attention replaces intimacy, and sex becomes a shortcut to feeling alive. The tragedy is that it never satisfies for long, because what the nervous system truly craves is integration. The ability to be both strong and vulnerable, admired and authentic, desired and deeply known. But if someone never developed that capacity, they chase intensity instead, and intensity burns out quickly. This is why you can watch someone sabotage a stable relationship and then immediately pursue someone new with the same hunger. It's not about the individual, it's about the temporary state shift. For a moment, they feel significant. For a moment, they feel powerful. For a moment, the numbness fades. Then the cycle restarts. And when Emily finally stopped asking, why her? And started asking what was he trying to feel? Something shifted inside her. The answer wasn't flattering. He wasn't trying to feel love. He wasn't trying to build a future. He wasn't trying to deepen connection. He was trying to feel real. And the hardest truth of all is this: you cannot compete with someone's need to escape themselves. You can be extraordinary. You can be loyal. You can be passionate. But if someone feels disconnected from their own core, no external relationship will anchor them. This understanding doesn't remove the pain. It doesn't excuse betrayal. It doesn't magically erase trauma. But it changes the narrative. Instead of, I wasn't enough, it becomes, he doesn't know how to exist without stimulation. Instead of, she replaced me, it becomes, he was trying to outrun emptiness. And that is a completely different story. When someone cannot tolerate stillness, they chase movement. When someone cannot tolerate silence, they create noise. When someone cannot tolerate their own interior, they seek exterior validation. Intimacy becomes a drug, not because sex is inherently addictive, but because feeling real is intoxicating when you've been numb. The deeper work, the work of sitting in discomfort, processing childhood wounds, building internal stability, is slow and uncomfortable. Quick fixes are easier. Quick fixes feel powerful. Quick fixes offer immediate relief. But relief is not the same as healing. And this is where the true fork in the road appears. Some people eventually recognize the pattern and choose to confront it. They seek therapy. They confront their past. They sit in the discomfort. They dismantle the persona. They learn to feel. Others double down. They escalate. They rationalize. They blame. They collect more evidence of desirability. But the void remains. Understanding this does not require you to stay. Understanding this does not require you to fix them. It simply allows you to step out of the illusion that you were ever the problem. Because you were not insufficient. You were encountering someone who had never learned how to feel whole from the inside out. And until someone chooses to confront that internal emptiness, no relationship, no matter how loving, can save them from themselves. The void is quiet, but it is powerful. And if you don't understand it, you will keep personalizing behavior that was never truly about you. The deeper question was never, why did he want her? The deeper question was, what is he running from? When you begin asking that question, the narrative shifts from comparison to clarity. And clarity is the first step toward freedom. Conquest over connection, the evidence collection. There is something even more unsettling than the void. It is not the emptiness itself. It is what someone builds to hide it. When Emily finally began to detach from the question of why her, she noticed something she had ignored for years. Daniel did not talk about his past partners the way someone talks about relationships. He talked about them like milestones, like trophies, like proof. And there was a certain tone in his voice when he mentioned the model he dated in his 20s. A subtle pride when he referenced the coworker who had risked her job to be with him. A smirk when he described how someone who had initially rejected him eventually gave in. It wasn't tenderness, it wasn't longing, it was conquest. That distinction is everything, because for someone with fragile internal worth, intimacy is not about merging, it is about winning. And winning is evidence. Imagine again that courtroom inside the mind. The case is always open. The accusation is relentless. You are not enough. You are ordinary. You are invisible. Every new conquest becomes a counter-argument. And she chose me. He couldn't resist me. I can still attract someone younger. I can still take what I want. Each encounter is like placing another file into a growing stack labeled proof that I matter. This is not romance. This is documentation. It's not about feeling close to someone, it's about feeling validated by someone. And here's where it becomes painfully clear why connection is often less appealing than conquest. Connection requires exposure. Conquest requires performance. Exposure is risky. Performance is controlled. When someone connects deeply, they have to show the parts of themselves that are insecure, uncertain, flawed. They have to sit in emotional reciprocity. They have to tolerate vulnerability. But conquest? Conquest is clean. Conquest is about pursuit. Conquest is about seduction. A conquest is about the moment of surrender. And the moment of surrender is intoxicating because it confirms power. For Daniel, the moment someone leaned in, reciprocated a flirtation, crossed a line, or broke a boundary, that was the high point. Not the relationship that followed, not the intimacy that deepened, but the moment of proof, the moment he could internally say, I still have it. This is why numbers can start to matter, not because of lust alone, but because quantity becomes a scoreboard. It becomes measurable evidence. The more varied the partners, the stronger the illusion. Different backgrounds, different levels of attractiveness, different statuses. Each new variation strengthens the narrative. I am universally desirable. It's not about preference, it's about universality. And the more unlikely the conquest, even the more powerful the validation. This is why unavailable people can become targets. Someone married. Someone who said no at first. Someone who seemed out of reach. If that person can be seduced, it feels like a higher value victory. The difficulty amplifies the proof. Because now it isn't just about being wanted. It's about being powerful enough to override obstacles. And here is the part that devastates partners like Emily. It means the intimacy you thought was sacred may have been, at least in part, symbolic. When Daniel first pursued Emily, he was intense, attentive, charming, focused. She felt chosen. But in hindsight, she began to see the pattern. The intensity peaked at the moment she committed. The seduction phase was electric. Once stability arrived, the energy shifted, because the conquest had already been logged. You exhibit complete. The thrill wasn't in building a life. The thrill was in securing the yes. This does not mean there were no real feelings at all. Human beings are complex. Even someone with narcissistic patterns can experience affection. But the driving engine beneath the affection was often proof, and proof loses intensity once secured. This is why some people with these tendencies appear to become restless in long-term relationships, not because they cannot love at all, but because love is not the primary fuel. Validation is, and validation fades quickly. Here is another layer that rarely gets discussed. When someone is collecting evidence of their worth externally, they are also protecting themselves from internal collapse. Because if the evidence stops, the old accusation resurfaces. You are not enough. And that voice can be unbearable. So the collecting continues. Marcus once admitted during a rare moment of honesty that the worst nights were the quiet ones, the nights when no one texted, the nights when the social invitations slowed down, the nights when he lay alone in his Los Angeles apartment and the silence felt heavy. It wasn't loneliness in the traditional sense, it was exposure. Without an audience, without admiration, without a recent conquest, he felt ordinary. And ordinary felt dangerous. This is the paradox. The very behaviors that appear confident on the surface are often driven by a fear of insignificance, the flirtation, the seduction, the string of partners. They are not random indulgences, they are strategic reassurance, reassurance that the self is intact, reassurance that power still exists, reassurance that admiration can still be summoned. This is also why someone like Daniel could sleep with a person he didn't particularly like, because liking them wasn't required, desiring them deeply wasn't required. What was required was their response, their yes, their willingness, their validation. The human being becomes secondary, the reaction becomes primary. And this is the moment where many partners experience a painful realization. They weren't in a romantic triangle, they were in a psychological system, a system where every person serves as a mirror, and mirrors are replaceable. This realization can sting more than jealousy. Because jealousy at least implies preference, replaceability implies utility. But here's the crucial shift. If you understand that the system was about evidence, not connection, then you begin to detach from comparison. It was never, she was more beautiful. It was, she was available. It was never, he loved her more. It was, he needed another file for the case. That doesn't erase the hurt, but it changes its meaning. Instead of seeing yourself as having lost a competition, you see that you were part of someone's evidence collection strategy. And evidence collection never ends, because no amount of proof ever silences insecurity permanently. This is why the cycle repeats, why the thrill fades, why the hunger returns. Because what they are trying to prove cannot be proven through conquest. Worth cannot be accumulated through bodies. Significance cannot be built on seduction. Power cannot create belonging. But until someone confronts that truth internally, they will continue gathering proof externally. And it can even escalate over time. The earlier conquests no longer satisfy. The proof needs to be stronger, more dramatic, more impressive, more risky. Because the old files lose their charge, the nervous system adapts, the ego recalibrates, and the case is never truly closed. This is why some people can look back on decades of relationships and still feel restless. The archive grows, but the verdict never stabilizes, and this is where connection becomes almost threatening. Because real connection would require dismantling the case entirely. It would require saying, I am enough without proof. That is a terrifying leap for someone who has built their entire identity around external validation. So they avoid that leap. They stay in conquest mode. They keep the courtroom open. They keep collecting evidence. And in doing so, they sacrifice depth for volume. Emily's breakthrough came not when she stopped loving Daniel, but when she stopped trying to decode his choices through romance. She realized that she had been asking, why did he prefer her? When the real question was, what did he need to prove? And once she saw that, something inside her softened, not toward him, but toward herself. Because if the system was never about her inadequacy, she could finally release the comparison. She could finally see that she was not replaced by someone superior. She was simply part of a cycle that required constant validation. And cycles like that do not end because you become better. They end because someone confronts their insecurity, or because you step out of the system entirely. When conquest replaces connection, intimacy loses its meaning, and it becomes a transaction, a tally, a record. And until someone learns to close the case within themselves, they will keep seeking verdicts from others. The tragedy is not that they slept with someone else. The tragedy is that they never learned how to believe they were enough without needing to win. And once you understand that, the narrative shifts again. From, I wasn't chosen, to, they are still trying to choose themselves. And that shift, however painful, is the beginning of clarity. When you are the primary partner. Weaponized indiscrimination. Rachel didn't cry when she first found out. That surprised her. She stood in the kitchen of her New York City apartment, hands resting on the cold marble counter, and listened as Thomas explained what he had done. The words felt surreal, almost clinical. There had been someone else. Even it had happened more than once. It didn't mean anything. That phrase lingered in the air long after he stopped talking. It didn't mean anything. At first, Rachel interpreted it as dismissal, as indifference, as cruelty. But over time, she realized it was something even more destabilizing. It was devaluation. When you are the primary partner of someone with narcissistic patterns, indiscriminate intimacy stops being impulsive. It becomes strategic, whether consciously or unconsciously. It becomes a way to reshape the power dynamic inside the relationship. Because when someone cheats with a person who appears extraordinary, you can at least construct a narrative. They fell in love. They were swept away. They met someone remarkable. It hurts, but it makes psychological sense. But when they cheat with someone they themselves described as mediocre, irritating, incompatible, that is different. That is disorienting. That is destabilizing. Because the message underneath it is not, I found someone better. The message is, it doesn't take much. And when it doesn't take much, you are forced into an impossible position. You begin to question your own value, not in comparison to someone superior, but in comparison to anyone. Anyone. That is the quiet violence of indiscriminate betrayal inside a primary relationship. It erodes specialness, it erodes exclusivity, it erodes the sense that your bond had meaning. Rachel kept replaying the details in her mind. Thomas had described the woman as nothing serious. He had mocked her style before. He had rolled his eyes at her opinions, and so why risk everything for someone he didn't even respect? The answer wasn't romantic, it was structural. Inside a primary relationship, indiscriminate behavior becomes a way of asserting power. Not necessarily power over the affair partner, power over you. Because once you discover that your partner will step outside the relationship for almost anyone, your nervous system shifts. You become hyper-aware, you scan rooms differently, you analyze text differently, you monitor tone changes, you question silences, your sense of security fractures. And insecurity creates dependence. You start trying harder, you become more accommodating, more attentive, more forgiving, more cautious. You try to prove your irreplaceability. But here's the paradox. When someone experiences others as interchangeable, no amount of excellence will make you irreplaceable in their internal system. Because the system was never built around uniqueness. It was built around utility. Indiscriminate betrayal communicates something devastating without ever saying it directly. It says your qualities are not what anchor me. Your intelligence, your loyalty, your depth, your shared history. None of those function as protective factors, and when those qualities don't protect you, you begin to feel exposed. This is where trauma bonding often deepens, because now you are trying to regain a sense of control in an environment that feels unpredictable. Rachel noticed that after the affair came to light, she became quieter. Not weaker, quieter. She started measuring her words. She avoided conflict. She became more agreeable, hoping that stability would return. But stability did not return. Because the instability was not situational. It was internal to Thomas. And here is something many people struggle to accept. The indiscriminate nature of the betrayal is the mechanism. If Thomas had cheated with someone extraordinary, Rachel could have framed it as competition. But when he cheated with someone random, the message was more destabilizing. You are not competing with someone special. You are competing with availability. And that creates a state of chronic insecurity. If anyone can be chosen, then no one is secure. This insecurity keeps the primary partner emotionally off balance. And an off-balance partner is easier to manage. Again, this may not be a calculated strategy in a conscious way. Many narcissistic dynamics operate below awareness. But the effect is real. You start trying to earn a position you already held. You start negotiating for reassurance that used to be implicit. You become preoccupied with proving your value. Meanwhile, the person who destabilized the relationship may present themselves as calm. Thomas often responded to Rachel's pain with irritation. You're overreacting. It didn't mean anything. Why are you making this so dramatic? Notice what happens there. The very randomness of the betrayal is used to minimize it. It meant nothing. As if meaninglessness makes it harmless, but in reality, meaninglessness makes it more damaging. Because if intimacy meant nothing to him, then what did their exclusivity mean? What did their promises mean? What did their shared years mean? When someone can step outside a primary relationship without regard for standards, it communicates fungibility, replaceability, and that can fracture a person's identity. Rachel began to question her own perception. She wondered if she was exaggerating the severity of what happened. After all, he insisted it wasn't serious. But her body knew differently. Her sleep changed, her appetite shifted, her chest tightened whenever he left the house. Her nervous system understood what her rational mind was trying to soften. Security had been compromised. And here is another layer that often goes unnoticed. Indiscriminate betrayal can create competition where none existed before. Rachel found herself comparing her appearance to women she would have previously ignored. She questioned her age, her body, her desirability. Not because the other woman was superior, but because if the threshold for betrayal is low, the threat field becomes wide. This creates hypervigilance. Hypervigilance creates anxiety. Anxiety creates emotional reactivity. And emotional reactivity can then be used against you. You're insecure. You're controlling. You're paranoid. Now the destabilized partner is reframed as the problem. The person reacting to betrayal becomes the one accused of dysfunction. This inversion of responsibility is one of the most psychologically exhausting aspects of weaponized indiscrimination. Because you are not only managing pain, you are defending your sanity. And when you try to explain how the randomness of the betrayal hurt more than the act itself, you may be met with confusion or dismissal. How is it worse if it meant nothing? It is worse because it communicates disposability, and it is worse because it reveals that boundaries are not sacred. It is worse because it suggests that no amount of loyalty secures your position. Rachel eventually recognized something that changed her internal narrative. She had been trying to restore specialness in a system that did not prioritize it. She had been trying to negotiate exclusivity with someone who experienced intimacy as utility. And until she understood that, she kept thinking she could fix it by becoming more loving, more desirable, more patient. But this is the critical turning point. You cannot earn sacredness from someone who does not experience intimacy as sacred. You cannot outperform a structural instability. You cannot win a competition that was never about excellence. When indiscriminate behavior becomes normalized inside a primary relationship, and the partner often oscillates between anger and self-doubt. Anger says, "I deserve better." Self-doubt whispers, "What if I wasn't enough?" The breakthrough comes when you see that both reactions are understandable, but neither defines the full truth. The full truth is this: the betrayal was not about upgrading, it was about control. Not necessarily control over you in an overt sense, but control over their own internal fragility. And when someone manages their internal instability through external indiscrimination, the primary partner becomes collateral damage. This realization can feel heavy, but it is also clarifying. Because once you stop framing the betrayal as a referendum on your worth, you begin reclaiming your center. Rachel did not immediately leave Thomas, but something shifted, and she stopped trying to compete with anyone. She stopped obsessively comparing herself to random women. She stopped believing that perfection would guarantee safety, and instead she started asking a different question. Can I feel secure with someone who treats intimacy as interchangeable? That question is empowering, because it shifts the focus from fixing yourself to evaluating the structure you are inside. When you are the primary partner, indiscriminate behavior can feel like an earthquake, but earthquakes reveal fault lines that were already there. And sometimes the most powerful act is not proving you are special enough to stay. It is recognizing that your value does not depend on someone else's inability to see it. Weaponized indiscrimination thrives on confusion. Clarity dissolves it. And clarity begins when you stop asking how to become irreplaceable in someone else's system, and start asking whether that system deserves you at all. The missing structure. Why they have no internal brakes. There is a moment in almost every conversation Rachel had with Thomas after the betrayal when she found herself saying the same sentence in different forms. Don't you see what this is doing to us? Sometimes she said it softly, sometimes through tears, sometimes through clenched teeth. And every time she expected something very human to happen. She expected the pause, that pause most of us feel when we realize we've hurt someone we love, the internal tightening, the wave of guilt, the instinct to step back, to repair, to take responsibility. But the pause rarely came. Thomas could explain himself, he could rationalize, he could promise, he could even appear remorseful in the moment. But when similar temptations appeared again, the behavior repeated. And that is the part that feels incomprehensible. It's not just the betrayal, it's not just the void, it's not just the conquest, it's the absence of internal restraint. Most psychologically healthy adults operate with an internal braking system. It's subtle, but it's powerful. You feel attraction, you feel temptation, you feel impulse, and then something inside you intervenes. You think about consequences, you think about the person you love, you think about the values you claim to hold, you think about who you want to be. That internal dialogue creates a gap between impulse and action. I want to, but I won't. That gap is the difference between desire and behavior. It's the architecture of integrity. But what happens when that architecture is underdeveloped? What happens when the internal guardrails never fully formed? To understand this, we have to move even deeper into developmental psychology. Children do not emerge with fully formed conscience structures. They develop them over time through attuned caregiving, boundaries, empathy, and consistent accountability. When a child experiences healthy limits, they internalize those limits. When they hurt someone and a caregiver responds with calm correction rather than shame or neglect, they begin to develop guilt. Not toxic shame, but relational guilt. Relational guilt says, I did something wrong. Toxic shame says, I am something wrong. When shame dominates, the psyche often defends itself by externalizing blame, instead of, I hurt you. It becomes, you're too sensitive. Instead of, I crossed a line, it becomes, it wasn't a big deal. Over time, if empathy is not consistently modeled and reinforced, the internal mechanism that says pause can weaken. You can intellectually understand rules without emotionally integrating them. You can know right from wrong in theory without feeling the weight of violating it. This is where someone like Daniel can look at Emily's tears and understand that she is hurt, but not feel the full internal break that would permanently redirect his behavior. This is where Thomas can tell Rachel he loves her, and even believe it in that moment, but still act in ways that fracture the bond later. It's not that they lack intelligence, it's not that they are unaware of social norms, and it's that their internal structure is fragile. And when impulse collides with weak internal restraint, impulse often wins. Many partners try to solve this with logic. Rachel tried to reason with Thomas. She explained long-term consequences. She explained how trust erodes. She explained how repeated betrayal would eventually end the relationship. He listened, he nodded, he even agreed. But agreement in the moment does not equal integration. You cannot reason someone into an internal structure they never built. You cannot argue someone into empathy if empathy is not deeply rooted. You cannot negotiate someone into self-regulation if self-regulation was never securely developed. And this is the painful recognition many partners resist for years. They believe that if they just communicate better, explain better, forgive better, or love harder, the other person will change. But appeals to logic only work when there is a stable internal compass to receive them. If the primary question inside someone's mind is not, is this aligned with my values? But, can I manage the fallout? Then the brake system is already compromised. The guiding question becomes, will I get caught? Can I smooth this over? Can I minimize the damage? Instead of, is this who I want to be? The absence of internal brakes doesn't always look dramatic. It can look like chronic rationalization. It was just once. It didn't mean anything. You're overreacting. Everyone does it. These phrases are not random. They are protective. They protect the fragile self from confronting its own inconsistency. Because confronting inconsistency would require tolerating guilt, and tolerating guilt requires emotional maturity. When guilt is intolerable, it gets converted into blame. And that is why the betrayed partner often ends up carrying not only the pain of the betrayal, but the burden of being told they are the problem. If Rachel expressed anger, Thomas sometimes reframed it as instability. If she demanded accountability, he reframed it as control. Notice the inversion. The absence of internal brakes creates external chaos. But instead of owning the chaos, the person deflects it. Because deflection preserves ego stability. Here is another layer that deepens this understanding. Impulse control is closely tied to the ability to tolerate discomfort. When someone feels tempted, what are they really experiencing? Restlessness, curiosity, desire, ego stimulation. And to not act on that requires tolerating discomfort. to sit in the urge without satisfying it, to let the impulse rise and fall. That capacity is learned, it is strengthened over time. If someone has historically managed discomfort by escaping it, through attention, seduction, stimulation, then the muscle of tolerance remains weak. And without tolerance, there is no pause. Without pause, there is no break. Without break, there is repetition. This is why many people in these dynamics appear to change briefly after being confronted. The external consequences temporarily substitute for internal restraint. Fear of losing the relationship creates a temporary break. Fear of exposure creates a temporary break. Fear of social embarrassment creates a temporary break. But once the external pressure fades, the internal structure remains unchanged, and the behavior often returns. This is not a moral condemnation, it is a structural reality. Integrity is not built through promises. It is built through internalized values, and internalized values are built through years of consistent development. When that development is fractured, adulthood becomes performance rather than embodiment. The person knows what they should do, but knowing is not the same as being able to do. This is the sobering truth Rachel eventually confronted. Thomas did not lack intelligence. He lacked integration, and integration cannot be installed by a partner. It can only be developed by the person themselves through deep introspection, therapy, accountability, and sustained effort. This is where many relationships reach a crossroads. You can continue appealing to structures that do not exist, or you can accept that the absence of internal breaks means you will always be the one scanning for danger, always the one bracing for impact, always the one trying to anticipate impulse before it turns into action. And that is an exhausting way to live. Understanding the missing structure does not automatically mean leaving, but it does mean adjusting your expectations. It means recognizing that the change you're hoping for requires internal rebuilding, not external negotiation. It means asking yourself whether you are willing to live inside a system where restraint depends on surveillance rather than conscience. Because that is what happens when internal brakes are weak. Accountability must come from outside. Monitoring increases, boundaries tighten, trust decreases. And then the relationship becomes less about partnership and more about containment. No one thrives in containment. Not you, not them. The tragedy of the missing structure is not just that it leads to betrayal. It is that it prevents genuine safety. Safety requires predictability. Predictability requires self-regulation. Self-regulation requires internal brakes. Without them, love becomes conditional on circumstances rather than character. And circumstances change. Temptations appear. Ego wounds happen. Opportunities arise. If character is not strong enough to anchor behavior, then behavior will shift with the wind. That realization is painful, but it is clarifying. Because once you stop mistaking promises for structure, you stop confusing words for safety. You begin evaluating patterns instead of explanations. You begin asking, is there evidence of internal growth? Is there sustained accountability? Is there real remorse that translates into changed behavior? Or is there only temporary compliance followed by repetition? Rachel eventually understood that her deepest longing was not for apologies. It was for predictability. She didn't need perfection. She needed stability. And stability does not come from charm. It comes from character. When internal breaks are present, you feel it. You feel the consistency, you feel the reliability, you feel the alignment between words and actions. When they are absent, you feel that too. You feel the volatility, you feel the unpredictability, you feel the constant low-grade anxiety of not knowing when impulse will override commitment. And that anxiety erodes intimacy faster than betrayal itself. Because intimacy cannot grow where safety is uncertain. The missing structure explains why love alone is not enough. It explains why logic often fails. It explains why repeated conversations don't always lead to lasting change. And once you see that clearly, you are no longer arguing about isolated incidents. You are evaluating architecture, and architecture determines whether a structure can withstand pressure. If the foundation is cracked, no amount of decoration will make it stable. You cannot decorate your way into security. You cannot persuade your way into someone else's conscience. But you can choose whether you remain inside a structure that lacks internal brakes. That choice is not simple, it is not quick, it is not without grief, but it is grounded in reality, and reality, even when painful, is the beginning of self-respect. And because once you understand that the absence of restraint is not about your worth, you stop internalizing someone else's structural deficiency as your personal failure. And that shift, from self-blame to structural clarity, is a turning point that changes everything. The real tragedy in your way forward. There is a moment after the anger fades and the explanations lose their power when a deeper sadness sets in. It's not the sharp pain of betrayal. It's not the obsessive replaying of events. It's not even the jealousy anymore. It's grief. Not just grief for what happened. Grief for what never truly existed. Emily felt it first. Long after the confrontation with Daniel, long after the arguments and the silence and the sleepless nights, she found herself sitting alone one evening in her Chicago apartment with a realization that was both devastating and clarifying. No matter how many people Daniel pursued, no matter how many times someone said yes to him, he never looked satisfied. He looked restless. Even in photos from years ago, she could see it now. The smile was there, the charisma was there, the confidence was there. But there was something else too. A searching, as if every achievement, every flirtation, every conquest was a temporary fix to a problem that kept resurfacing. That is the real tragedy. Not that a narcissist will sleep with almost anyone. The real tragedy is that no one they sleep with will ever be enough. Because the hunger is not for a person, it is for an internal feeling that cannot be supplied externally. And the cycle does not resolve itself, it intensifies. Marcus once described this sensation to a therapist after another relationship dissolved in Los Angeles. He said, "I always think the next one will feel different, like maybe this time I'll feel settled. And then a few weeks in, I feel the same restlessness. That restlessness is the loop. Validation arrives, excitement spikes, proof accumulates, the void returns, and the repetition becomes more automatic over time. What begins as flirtation becomes habit. What begins as occasional betrayal becomes pattern. What begins as insecurity becomes identity. This is why the tragedy deepens as the years pass. Because while the number of encounters increases, the sense of wholeness does not. And here is the uncomfortable truth many partners avoid. You cannot break that cycle for them. You cannot love someone into integration, and you cannot be loyal enough to cure someone else's fragmentation. You cannot sacrifice enough to fill a bottomless container. Rachel eventually reached this realization too. After months of trying to rebuild trust with Thomas in New York City, after cycles of remorse and relapse, after promises that sounded sincere and explanations that felt logical, she noticed something. She was shrinking, not physically, internally. She was monitoring her tone, editing her reactions, lowering her standards, avoiding certain conversations to prevent conflict. She was trying to become easier to keep. That is the secondary tragedy. When you stay in a dynamic driven by someone else's void, you begin to organize your life around it. You become hyper-aware of their moods. You become responsible for their regulation. You become invested in preventing their next impulse. And slowly, without realizing it, you disconnect from yourself. You trade stability for hope. You trade boundaries for potential. You trade clarity for confusion. This is where the shift must happen, not in them, in you. The real tragedy is not only that they are stuck in a cycle, it is that you might become stuck trying to save them from it. There is a profound sadness in recognizing that someone you loved may never experience intimacy the way you do. They may never feel fully satisfied by connection. They may never anchor themselves in exclusivity. They may never develop the internal brakes that create safety. That does not make them monsters, but it does mean they are limited, and loving someone does not erase their limitations. So what does your way forward look like? Either it begins with radical honesty, not about them, about yourself. What have you tolerated in the name of understanding? What have you excused in the name of compassion? What have you minimized in the name of loyalty? Compassion is beautiful, but compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Understanding someone's wound does not require you to become collateral damage. Emily's turning point came when she stopped trying to decode Daniel's psychology for the purpose of saving the relationship and started understanding it for the purpose of saving herself. She realized that clarity was not meant to make her stay. It was meant to make her free. Freedom does not always mean leaving immediately. Sometimes it means emotionally detaching before physically detaching. And sometimes it means rebuilding your internal stability while still evaluating the relationship. But it always involves reclaiming your center. That reclamation requires action. It requires rebuilding your nervous system. When betrayal destabilizes you, your body carries it. Your sleep patterns shift. Your appetite fluctuates. Your mind scans for threats. Healing is not just intellectual, it is physiological. Reclaiming yourself may mean breath work that calms your nervous system. It may mean strength training that reconnects you to your body. It may mean therapy that helps you untangle trauma bonds. It may mean journaling that anchors your reality when gaslighting lingers in your thoughts. It may mean reconnecting with friends who knew you before this relationship defined you. And it may mean rediscovering hobbies that existed before your identity revolved around managing someone else's instability. The goal is not to become hardened. The goal is to become grounded. Grounded in your worth. Grounded in your boundaries. Grounded in your standards. When you rebuild that internal ground, something powerful happens. You stop asking, how do I make them choose me? And you start asking, is this someone capable of choosing consistently? That shift is everything. Because you cannot build a stable future on someone else's fluctuating self-esteem. You cannot anchor your security to someone who relies on external stimulation to feel alive. You deserve a partner whose internal world is stable enough to sustain intimacy, not perfect, not flawless, but integrated. And the real tragedy is that the narcissist may continue chasing validation for decades. The real liberation is that you do not have to chase them. You do not have to compete with a void. You do not have to prove your irreplaceability. You do not have to exhaust yourself trying to be enough for someone who cannot feel enough. You are never lacking. You are offering depth to someone who is operating at the level of transaction. You are offering connection to someone seeking proof. You are offering presence to someone fleeing themselves. And there is nothing shameful about loving deeply. But there is something powerful about knowing when to stop sacrificing your stability for someone else's instability. Daniel may continue searching for the next reflection. Marcus may continue mistaking intensity for aliveness. Thomas may continue negotiating with temptation instead of integrating restraint. But Rachel, Emily, and anyone listening to this has a choice. You can continue orbiting someone else's void, or you can return to yourself. Returning to yourself means rebuilding trust in your perceptions. It means honoring your discomfort instead of suppressing it. It means recognizing that anxiety inside a relationship is information, not weakness. It means understanding that love without safety is not sustainable. The final truth is not dramatic, it is quiet. They were running from themselves. You do not have to run with them. You can stop, you can breathe, you can rebuild. And you can choose a life where intimacy is not a transaction, not a weapon, not a scoreboard, but a sanctuary. The tragedy is that they may never experience that sanctuary. And the empowerment is that you still can. And the moment you choose yourself over chaos is the moment the cycle finally ends. At least for you. Emily loved a man who was always searching. Daniel was charismatic, attentive in the beginning, magnetic in a room full of strangers. He knew how to make her feel chosen. But over time, she began to notice a quiet pattern beneath the charm. He was never settled. Even in moments of success, admiration, or intimacy, there was something restless in him. When he cheated, it shattered her, not only because of the betrayal, but because of who he chose. It wasn't someone extraordinary, it wasn't someone who made sense. It was someone random, almost careless. And that randomness was the most painful part. Marcus lived a similar story in Los Angeles. Outwardly successful, socially confident, I constantly desired, yet internally unanchored. Every new encounter gave him a surge of aliveness, a fleeting sense of certainty. But the certainty evaporated quickly. The pattern repeated. Conquest after conquest, connection after connection, and still the same hollow restlessness returned. What looked like abundance was actually accumulation, collecting proof in an endless internal trial about his own worth. Rachel's story in New York City revealed another layer. As the primary partner of Thomas, she didn't just experience betrayal. She experienced destabilization. When he slept with someone he barely respected, the message wasn't romantic, it was existential. If anyone would do, then what did exclusivity mean? She began shrinking herself, adjusting her reactions, trying to restore a sense of safety by becoming easier to keep. But the more she adjusted, the less grounded she felt. Across all these stories, one truth becomes clear. The real tragedy was not that these men sought others. It was that they were running from emptiness, from insecurity, from a fragile internal structure that could not hold steady. Intimacy was not connection for them. It was regulation. Conquest was not passion. It was proof. And proof never lasts. The deeper tragedy is that partners often internalize this behavior as their own inadequacy. They compare. They compete. They question their beauty, their value, their effort. But the cycle was never about replacing someone with someone better. It was about temporarily escaping an internal void. The lesson here is profound. You cannot compete with someone's unresolved emptiness. You cannot love someone into internal stability. You cannot sacrifice enough to fill a space that was never yours to fill. And here is how you apply this lesson to your life right now. First, stop personalizing behavior that originates in someone else's fragmentation. When someone repeatedly seeks validation outside the relationship, ask yourself whether the issue is your worth or their inability to regulate themselves. Second, observe patterns instead of promises. Words are easy. Sustainable change requires internal structure. Look for consistency, accountability, and growth over time, not emotional speeches after crises. Third, reclaim your center, rebuild your nervous system, reconnect with your body, strengthen your boundaries. Reinvest in friendships, hobbies, ambitions that exist outside the relationship. The goal is not to become hardened but grounded. Fourth, redefine intimacy for yourself. True intimacy is not intensity. It is not competition. It is not proof. It is safety, predictability, mutual regard, and shared presence. Do not settle for transactions when you are capable of connection. The story of Emily, Marcus, Rachel, Daniel, and Thomas is not just about narcissism, it is about clarity. It is about recognizing when love becomes a system of validation rather than a sanctuary of connection. Now I want to ask you something. When you look back at your own experiences, what feels more accurate? A. I stayed because I believed I could eventually be enough for them. B. I stayed because I was afraid to let go of the version of them I hoped they would become. Comment A or B below. I genuinely want to see where you stand. And beyond that, what are your thoughts? Do you believe people like Daniel or Thomas can truly change if they commit to deep internal work? Or do you think the cycle usually continues? Share your perspective in the comments so everyone can learn from different experiences. If this conversation resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating honest, psychologically grounded content that empowers people to understand, heal, and move forward with clarity. Your story matters. Your healing matters. And the more we talk about these patterns openly, the less power they have over us.